I think most people think of the media as being a natural ally in access to information, but in your case, it was not, and I've heard from some of the other resource people that they've also had problems working with the media to try to get them to use the right information.
Yeah, well, when we started working on these issues in the late 90s, I remember I was invited to a meeting with journalists and some experts on freedom of information from the US in Argentina. And there was not a single journalist who was even aware of the right to access to information. And they were actually very skeptic. They thought that it was not the right way to look for information. And they were, many of them, and also media owners, opposed to any kind of legislation. You know that in the field of free speech, media owners and journalists usually say that the best law is the law that doesn't exist. So they apply the same principle. I disagree with that principle too, but it's a different matter. But they apply the same principle to the freedom of information regulation. They think that governments will use that legislation in order to block freedom of expression and freedom of information. So we had a lot of opposition in the beginning from the media. But it changed. I mean, it was very easy to show that it was an important tool for them too, to get this regulation passed.
Well, on this point and on the civil society, and I think it's important for people who are thinking about developing projects to promote use of the access to information law, there are a number of hurdles which have to be overcome. Journalists' traditional ways of working are to use their sources inside government. And a good journalist sees themselves as being someone who's got good sources. And it's very interesting that in Ireland, there are some journalists who are using the access to information law, but when they get the information, they don't mention that in their articles. They prefer to say, according to sources inside government, because it makes them look like better journalists. Even where journalists are using the access to information law, that's one issue. Another issue is that, and this is both true for journalists and for civil society, is that to file an access to information request in many countries is seen as a somewhat conflictual, aggressive act. And if you are a journalist who spent a lot of time cultivating your sources within government, or if you're an NGO that's working on certain projects with government departments, and then you start filing access to information requests, it may be seen as something which is confrontational and may damage those existing relationships. And I've heard plenty of stories where that's happened. And where, for example, a public relations officer has phoned a journalist and said, why the hell are you filing an access to information request? Why didn't you just come and ask me? Well, the reason was because the journalist wants original copies of certain documents, which they're never going to get from the PR person. But I think we have to recognize that when we're working with people who we want to encourage them to use access to information laws, we have to recognize that filing an access to information request is probably not the first way in which someone's going to try to get information. They're going to try to use other contacts, other sources, and possibly even as somewhat of a last resort will say, well, we haven't managed to get this information in other ways, and then we're going to file the request for information. So it's one of the challenges for the freedom of information movement is working with people who are potential users of access to information and figuring out at what point in a research information gathering strategy is appropriate and timely and useful to use an to file that access to information request. And not to assume, as we sometimes, I think, us sort of missionaries proselytizing in favor of access to information will say, well, you should start immediately, file your access to information request. That's not a realistic expectation. It needs to be part of a more sophisticated and structured strategy for gathering information.
This is a question for Helen, but if others want to jump in, I'd be interested to hear. Helen, you were talking at one point about the strategies that all of us who are concerned with this issue need to use to reach out to journalists. Are there similar strategies to reach out to the NGO sector, or is it a similar dynamic? Have there been particular barriers that have come up to getting civil society groups to use FOI laws more? Thank you.
How to approach working with the NGO sector? I think it can be very useful to target a particular sector. Each sector has its particular information interests, what we've done in the aid sector is actually to map out the classes of information which are typically created in the cycle of decision-making and spending on aid projects. and then to try to evaluate which of those classes of information are made available proactively, and to promote the proactive publication of information in order that people don't have to file requests. And because of these concerns that I mentioned, where civil society organizations sometimes find that it's a bit uncomfortable filing an information request with a government department that you're working with closely already, and this would be in aid, in health, in education, whatever it might be. I think one of the strategies is to put greater emphasis on the proactive publication of information. I was thinking that this morning even, we haven't talked about that enough so far. If this is a right, if this is a human right, the burden should not be on the members of the public to file the request, to file the appeals, to go to the information commissioners, to try to get the information. There should be a much stronger emphasis on the obligation of public bodies to make available the vast majority of information which they hold, which is not sensitive and not classified. And in the modern internet age, it's so easy to post that on the web. Of course, a lot of people don't have access to the internet, and it's important to have other means of proactive publication as well. But by virtue of information being published on websites, then people can begin to get access to it, and civil society groups can take it and disseminate it more widely. And I think that if there are going to be projects collaborating with civil society, that would be my approach. Take it sector by sector, look at the information, and work with government to the extent possible to get less controversial information published proactively. And then the FOI battles are over the more sensitive documents, but the rest of it gets into the public domain, and I think really that's one of our challenges.
I think the issue of identifying the sectors and working with them according to their specific practice or field is key for the next strategy. And in that process, I think that there's one sector that we are all public interest people. I mean, but I think that there's something interesting to explore in the business sector.
Yeah.
You know that in the US and in many other countries, I think Canada or UK, most requests are filed by the business sector. In the States, I think it's between the 50 and 70-something%.
Lawyers working for businesses, yes.
Well, but that's a very important issue. That why is the business sector so active in these countries? And for instance, in mine, the business sector is not producing any request at all. Probably because we have been trying to explore this field, is related to the same thing that happened with the journalists or some NGOs that don't want to confront with the government. They need the government for some, regulations, interpretation of regulations. So at some point they don't want to confront with the government, so they don't file requests. But at the same time, this sector could be a very interesting, ally that we as public interest activists usually don't look at, and I think that. That's a very interesting thing to work on in that sector.